April 17th, 1975, Phnom Penh, Cambodia. You're a doctor performing emergency surgery when teenage soldiers with rifles burst into the operating room. They're wearing black pajamas and red scarves. They're pointing AK-47s at you, and they're giving you an order that makes no sense. Leave the city now. Everyone must leave. You explain that your patient will die if you stop. The soldier raises his rifle to your head. The Angkar has spoken. Everyone leaves. Now. Outside, you see something impossible. 2 million people, the entire population of Phnom Penh, walking in the same direction. Out of the city. Babies, elderly, sick, healthy, rich, poor. Hospital patients still connected to IVs being pushed in wheelchairs. A woman in labor being carried by family members. People carrying whatever they could grab in minutes. Soldiers, most barely teenagers, line the streets, black uniforms, emotionless faces, rifles ready. Someone asks where they're going. A soldier responds with 2 words that will define the next 4 years of hell: to the countryside. Another asks when they can return. The soldier smiles, a cold, empty smile, and says something that sounds insane. We are going to year 0. The old world is finished. Within 72 hours, Phnom Penh is empty. A city of 2 million reduced to a ghost town. Banks abandoned mid-transaction. Restaurants with food still on tables. Cars stopped in the middle of streets, doors open, keys in ignition. One of Southeast Asia's most vibrant cities has become a tomb of concrete and silence, and this is just the beginning. Over the next 4 years, between 1.5 and 2 million Cambodians will die. Out of a population of 8 million, 25% of the nation, 1 in 4 people, dead. From execution, starvation, disease, exhaustion. Not from war, not from natural disaster, but from policy, from ideology, from a vision of utopia so pure, so extreme, so detached from human reality that it became the most concentrated genocide in modern history. Pol Pot and the Khmer Rouge didn't just kill people. They tried to kill civilization itself. They abolished money, closed schools and hospitals, emptied cities, destroyed temples, separated families, executed anyone educated, anyone who wore glasses, anyone who spoke a foreign language, anyone who showed signs of thinking independently. And here's what should haunt you: the world knew. Western governments, the United Nations, neighboring countries, they knew what was happening, and they did almost nothing. When Vietnam finally invaded in 1979 and stopped the genocide, the West condemned Vietnam and continued recognizing Pol Pot's regime as Cambodia's legitimate government for another 14 years. This is the genocide the world forgot. The killing fields where children became executioners and intellectuals were murdered for the crime of being able to read. The regime so extreme that even Mao Zedong, whose policies had inspired it, told Pol Pot he'd gone too far. In our previous videos, we examined how Hitler used hope, Stalin used terror, Goebbels used media, and Mao used competitive loyalty to control populations. We explored why ordinary people obey authority unto murder. But Pol Pot represents something different: the logical endpoint when ideology becomes completely detached from human reality, when utopian vision requires destroying everything that makes us human. Let me take you to Cambodia in 1975. Let me show you how a nation destroyed itself in the name of purity, how teachers were executed by their former students, how wearing glasses became a death sentence, how an entire civilization was dragged backward into an imagined past that never existed. And let me show you why this forgotten genocide matters now, why Pol Pot's anti-intellectual violence, his contempt for education, his cult of ignorance and rural purity, these patterns haven't disappeared. They're recurring. In different forms, different contexts, but the same fundamental dynamic: the demonization of knowledge, the glorification of ignorance, the transformation of expertise into enemy. Year 0 has come before. It can come again, and the only defense is remembering what happened the last time someone tried to reset civilization. To understand what Pol Pot did, you need to understand what he believed. And to understand what he believed, you need to know where those beliefs came from. Pol Pot, born Saloth Sar in 1925, was educated in France in the 1950s. He studied radio electronics but spent most of his time in communist study groups, absorbing Marxist theory, meeting revolutionaries, developing his vision of perfect society. He was particularly influenced by Mao's Cultural Revolution and Stalin's collectivization, but he believed both had been too moderate, too compromising. He wanted something purer. His vision was simple and completely insane. Cambodia would return to an agrarian paradise. No cities, no money, no private property, no family structures beyond the collective, no religion, no education beyond basic literacy, no technology, no foreign influence, just peasants working the land in collective farms guided by the Ankar, the organization, which was the Khmer Rouge's name for itself, deliberately impersonal, deliberately mysterious. This wasn't communism as the Soviets or Chinese practiced it. This was something more extreme, an attempt to literally erase modern civilization and return to an imagined pre-industrial paradise that had never actually existed. Pol Pot called it Year Zero. Everything before the revolution would be forgotten, erased, destroyed. History would begin again. When the Khmer Rouge captured Phnom Penh on April 17, 1975, they immediately began implementing this vision. The evacuation of the cities was the first step. Cities represented everything wrong with modern Cambodia. Western influence, capitalism, intellectualism, corruption. Cities had to be emptied. Everyone would become peasants. Everyone would farm rice. This was the path to purity. The evacuation was catastrophic. People were given minutes to gather belongings. No vehicles except walking, no food provided. Soldiers claimed the evacuation was temporary, that American bombing was coming, that people would return in 3 days. All lies. The march lasted weeks. Thousands died on the roads from exhaustion, dehydration, execution for moving too slowly. When the evacuees reached the countryside, they discovered the truth. They weren't returning. This was permanent. Cities across Cambodia were emptied. Phnom Penh, Battambang, Siem Reap, all the urban centers reduced to ghost towns. The urban population, 2.5 million people, was forcibly relocated to rural work camps. And then the killing began in earnest. But not random killing. Systematic targeting of specific groups. The Khmer Rouge divided the population into categories. Base people, rural peasants who'd supported the revolution, were considered pure. New people, anyone from cities, anyone educated, anyone with connections to the old regime, were considered contaminated, suspect, expendable. The targeting was based on the most absurd and deadly criteria in genocide history. Teachers were executed because teaching represented the corrupt old education system. Doctors and nurses were killed because modern medicine was Western contamination. Engineers were murdered because technical knowledge threatened agrarian purity. Monks were executed because Buddhism was opiate of the masses. Anyone who spoke French or English was killed as a foreign agent. Anyone who wore glasses was executed because glasses meant literacy, and literacy meant education, and education meant thinking, and thinking was dangerous. Let me be very specific about this last point because it's so absurd it sounds like exaggeration. The Khmer Rouge literally executed people for wearing glasses. The logic was that glasses indicated reading, reading indicated education, education indicated intellectualism, and intellectuals were class enemies who must be eliminated. Thousands died for this reason alone. Children were separated from parents and indoctrinated. The Khmer Rouge wanted to create revolutionary youth uncorrupted by their parents' bourgeois values. They organized children into mobile work brigades, taught them to spy on adults, encouraged them to denounce their own parents. Some children were trained as executioners. Killing was easier for children who hadn't fully developed moral complexity, who could be taught that execution was revolutionary duty. Money was abolished. All currency declared worthless, markets closed, private property confiscated. Families weren't allowed to cook their own food. Everything was communal. You ate what the collective provided when they provided it, which often was almost nothing. Starvation was both accidental. The Khmer Rouge's agricultural policies were catastrophically incompetent, and intentional. Reducing food was a method of control. Religion was banned. Buddhist temples were destroyed or converted to storage facilities. Monks were defrocked and sent to labor camps. Islamic and Christian communities were targeted for elimination. The Khmer Rouge believed religion was superstition that distracted from revolutionary consciousness. Marriage and family were reorganized. The Khmer Rouge arranged marriages, often forcing couples who'd never met. Romance was bourgeois corruption. Love was counter-revolutionary. Couples were paired based on revolutionary utility. Children belonged to the collective, not to parents. And through all of this, the violence was constant and arbitrary. Questioning orders meant execution. Showing insufficient enthusiasm meant execution. Being educated meant execution. Having soft hands, evidence you hadn't done manual labor, could mean execution. Speaking nostalgically about the old days meant execution. Crying when family members were taken meant execution. The executions were brutally efficient and deliberately cruel. Bullets were expensive, so most victims were beaten to death with farm tools, hoes, axes, bamboo sticks. The Khmer Rouge established killing fields, remote locations where prisoners were taken at night, executed, and buried in mass graves. The most infamous, Chong Ek, contains the remains of over 8,000 people, but there are hundreds of such sites across Cambodia. The regime also established security centers for interrogation and torture. The most notorious was S21, also called Tuol Sleng, a former high school converted into a prison. Approximately 20,000 people passed through S21 between 1975 and 1979. 7 survived. 7. The prisoners were tortured until they confessed to absurd charges: being CIA agents, being Vietnamese spies, being members of counter-revolutionary networks that didn't exist. After confession, they were taken to the killing fields and executed. The Khmer Rouge documented everything with disturbing bureaucratic precision. They photographed prisoners, recorded confessions, filed execution reports. This documentation, now preserved in the Tuol Sleng Genocide Museum, provides devastating evidence of the systematic nature of the killing. Row after row of photographs, teachers, doctors, students, children, all tortured, all executed, all meticulously recorded. By 1979, Cambodia was devastated. The population was starving, traumatized, broken. The economy had collapsed, turning a rice-exporting nation into one facing famine. Infrastructure was destroyed. The educated class was almost entirely eliminated. Entire generations of teachers, doctors, engineers, intellectuals, gone. This is what Year Zero produced. Not utopia, hell, not purity, genocide, not revolutionary transformation, civilizational destruction. Pol Pot's attempt to create an agrarian paradise resulted in one of the most concentrated killing sprees in human history, destroying a quarter of his own population in pursuit of an ideology so divorced from reality that it could only be implemented through mass murder. And through it all, the world watched and did almost nothing. Here's the part of the story that should make you angry. The international community knew what was happening in Cambodia. Refugees flooded into Thailand telling stories of mass execution and starvation. Journalists reported on the genocide. Intelligence agencies documented the atrocities. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable, and the response was almost nothing. Because geopolitics mattered more than genocide. Cambodia sat in a complex Cold War position. The Khmer Rouge had come to power partly due to destabilization from the Vietnam War. The United States had secretly bombed Cambodia from 1969-1973, dropping more tonnage than on Japan during World War II, helping create chaos the Khmer Rouge exploited. After the Khmer Rouge took power, Cold War dynamics shaped international response. Vietnam, by 1978, was alarmed by Khmer Rouge border raids and increasingly aggressive rhetoric from Pol Pot. On December 25, 1978, Vietnam invaded Cambodia. By January 7, 1979, Vietnamese forces captured Phnom Penh. The Khmer Rouge fled to the countryside. The genocide was over. Vietnam had stopped the killing. They'd ended the nightmare. You'd think the international community would be grateful, would recognize Vietnam as liberator, would support the new Cambodian government. The opposite happened. The West condemned Vietnam for the invasion. China, which had supported the Khmer Rouge, attacked Vietnam's northern border in retaliation. The United States and its allies continued recognizing the Khmer Rouge as Cambodia's legitimate government. At the United Nations, the Khmer Rouge kept Cambodia's seat until 1993. Why? Geopolitics. Vietnam was a Soviet ally. China opposed Vietnam. The United States opposed anything that strengthened Soviet influence. So despite knowing about the genocide, despite mountains of evidence, despite the Khmer Rouge's obvious criminality, Western powers and China continued providing diplomatic recognition and limited support to the Khmer Rouge as the legitimate government in exile. This meant that while Cambodia was trying to rebuild under the Vietnamese-backed government, the Khmer Rouge continued receiving international legitimacy. They controlled Cambodia's UN seat. They received humanitarian aid that was diverted to military purposes. They maintained bases along the Thai border with tacit support from Thailand and China. They continued fighting a guerrilla war against the new government throughout the 1980s. The United States didn't directly arm the Khmer Rouge. That would have been politically impossible. But they supported non-communist resistance groups who allied with the Khmer Rouge. China provided direct military support. Thailand allowed Khmer Rouge bases and supply lines. The result was continued conflict, continued suffering for Cambodians who just wanted peace. This support for the Khmer Rouge wasn't secret. It was reported in newspapers. Human rights organizations protested, but Cold War logic prevailed. Better to recognize genocidal maniacs than to accept a Vietnamese-installed government that might strengthen Soviet influence in Southeast Asia. It wasn't until 1993, after the Cold War ended, that the international community finally withdrew recognition from the Khmer Rouge. By then, they'd held Cambodia's UN seat for 14 years after being overthrown. 14 years of diplomatic legitimacy for a regime that had murdered a quarter of its population. The genocide's toll was staggering. Estimates range from 1.5 to 2 million dead out of 8 million. The exact number will never be known. The Khmer Rouge didn't keep complete records, many bodies were never found, and Cambodia's infrastructure for documenting deaths was destroyed. But we know approximately 25% of Cambodia's population died between 1975 and 1979. Who died? Ethnic Vietnamese and Chinese were targeted for ethnic cleansing. The Cham Muslim minority was nearly destroyed. Almost half died. Buddhist monks were systematically killed. But the majority of victims were Cambodian, killed not for ethnicity or religion, but for education, for living in cities, for having the wrong class background, or simply for being in the wrong place when the Khmer Rouge needed to meet execution quotas. The psychological trauma was equally devastating. Families were destroyed, not just by death, but by the forced betrayals and denunciations the system required. Children who'd been turned into executioners or spies had to live with what they'd done. Survivors carried guilt for living when family members died. Trust was shattered. How do you rebuild a society where everyone informed on everyone, where children denounced parents, where survival sometimes required betraying others? Cambodia spent decades trying to recover. The physical reconstruction was difficult enough, infrastructure destroyed, educated workforce eliminated, economy collapsed. But psychological recovery was perhaps harder. How do you move forward when a quarter of your population is dead and almost everyone is traumatized? Justice was delayed and incomplete. Pol Pot died in 1998, never facing trial. He lived comfortably in the jungle, maintained by loyalists, dying of natural causes at 73. Many Khmer Rouge leaders lived into old age without punishment. It wasn't until 2006 that the extraordinary chambers in the courts of Cambodia, a hybrid tribunal with both Cambodian and international judges, was established to try surviving Khmer Rouge leaders. By then, most were elderly or dead. Only a handful of top leaders have been convicted. Keng Gwek Iav, who ran S21, was sentenced to life imprisonment. Nuon Chea and Khieu Samphan, senior Khmer Rouge leaders, were convicted of crimes against humanity and genocide. But these convictions came 30 to 40 years after the crimes, providing only limited justice for survivors. The killing fields remain. Many have been turned into memorials. Choeung Ek, the most famous, has a Buddhist stupa filled with skulls of victims. Tuol Sleng has become a genocide museum. These sites serve as evidence, as memorial, as warning. Tourists visit and leave devastated by the photographs, the torture equipment, the mass graves. But here's the question that should haunt us. Why did the world forget? Why is the Cambodian genocide less known than the Holocaust, the Armenian genocide, or the Rwandan genocide? Why do educated people know about Hitler and Stalin but not Pol Pot? Partly because it happened in Southeast Asia, remote from Western attention. Partly because Cold War politics made acknowledging the genocide inconvenient. Partly because Vietnam, the country that stopped it, was America's enemy, making the story complicated and uncomfortable. Partly because Cambodia was small, poor, and had limited geopolitical importance once the Cold War ended. But we can't forget. Because Pol Pot's ideology, the anti-intellectualism, the contempt for expertise, the glorification of ignorance, the demonization of education, the rejection of science and reason in favor of revolutionary purity, these patterns haven't disappeared. They recur, in different forms, different contexts, but the same fundamental dynamics. Let me show you where we're seeing year zero logic today. Pol Pot is dead. The Khmer Rouge is gone. Cambodia has rebuilt. But the ideological patterns that enabled the genocide, those haven't disappeared. They're recurring globally in ways that should terrify anyone who understands what happened in Cambodia. Pattern 1. Anti-intellectualism as political strategy. The Khmer Rouge killed people for wearing glasses, for speaking foreign languages, for having soft hands that indicated education rather than manual labor. This wasn't random cruelty. It was systematic targeting of anyone with education, expertise, or intellectual capacity. We're seeing this pattern reemerge. Political movements that explicitly attack universities, scientists, experts, journalists, rhetoric that frames education as elitist indoctrination, celebration of ignorance as authenticity, and contempt for expertise as populism. Conspiracy theories that cast educated professionals as enemies of the people. This isn't equivalent to Khmer Rouge genocide. No one is executing professors. But the underlying dynamic is similar, delegitimizing knowledge, framing expertise as threat, valorizing ignorance, creating permission structures for dismissing or attacking educated classes. Pattern 2. Nostalgia for imagined past. Pol Pot's Year Zero was built on fantasy of pure agrarian past that never existed. He imagined ancient Cambodia as paradise of peasant farmers, ignoring that Angkor Wat, Cambodia's greatest historical achievement, was built by sophisticated urbanized civilization with advanced engineering, astronomy, and art. Modern movements similarly idealize imaginary pasts, whether it's fantasies about 1950s America that ignore systemic racism and inequality, or visions of traditional societies that erase the violence and oppression of historical reality, or nationalist myths about ethnic purity in regions that have always been multi-ethnic. The pattern is similar, rejecting complex reality in favor of comforting fiction about simpler, purer past. Pattern 3. Purity spirals and ideological extremism. The Khmer Rouge's ideology became increasingly extreme through internal competition over who was most revolutionary. Any compromise was betrayal, any moderation was corruption. The only safe position was to be more extreme than everyone else. This created a purity spiral where the revolution devoured itself, killing its own leaders for insufficient revolutionary consciousness. We see this pattern in modern political and social movements, online communities where members compete to demonstrate ideological purity, where questioning any aspect of group dogma marks you as enemy, where yesterday's ally becomes today's target for insufficient loyalty. These dynamics rarely lead to genocide, but they create the psychological mechanisms that make extremism seem justified and violence against impure elements seem necessary. Pattern 4. Destruction of social trust. The Khmer Rouge forced children to spy on parents, encouraged denunciations, rewarded betrayal. This destroyed fundamental social bonds. After the genocide, Cambodia struggled to rebuild trust. How do you trust neighbors who might have informed on your family or former child soldiers who executed on command? Modern surveillance states and platforms that incentivize reporting create similar dynamics at smaller scale. Social credit systems where citizens report each other. Online platforms where reporting others earns status. Corporate cultures where employees are encouraged to document colleagues' violations. These systems fragment social solidarity and make trust difficult. Pattern 5. Techno-skepticism. Weaponized, the Khmer Rouge rejected modern medicine, closed hospitals, executed doctors. Rural traditional remedies were glorified while scientific medicine was condemned as Western corruption. Thousands died from treatable diseases because ideology rejected medical expertise. Modern rejection of scientific consensus on vaccines, climate change, evolution follows similar patterns. Not identical, we're not executing scientists. But the dynamic of rejecting expertise in favor of ideological certainty, of trusting intuition or tradition over systematic evidence, of viewing scientific establishment as corrupt conspiracy, This mirrors Khmer Rouge anti-science ideology. Now, I need to be absolutely clear. I'm not saying modern anti-intellectual movements are equivalent to the Khmer Rouge. They're not. No one is being executed for wearing glasses. No Western democracy is emptying cities or abolishing money. The scale and severity are completely different. But the patterns, the psychological and ideological patterns that made Khmer Rouge genocide possible, those are reappearing. And history teaches that these patterns, if allowed to develop without resistance, can escalate to catastrophic outcomes. The Khmer Rouge didn't start with genocide. They started with anti-intellectual rhetoric, with attacks on urban elites, with nostalgia for agrarian purity. The genocide came later, after these ideas had been normalized. This is why remembering Cambodia matters, not just to honor victims, not just for historical accuracy, but as warning system. When you see contempt for education, celebration of ignorance, nostalgia for imaginary pasts, purity spiral dynamics, destruction of social trust, rejection of expertise, these are warning signs. They don't guarantee genocide, but they create conditions where extremism can flourish. The lesson of Cambodia isn't anti-intellectualism always leads to genocide. It's anti-intellectualism created the conditions for genocide once, and the patterns we're seeing now rhyme with those conditions in ways that should concern us. Pol Pot's genocide killed 1.5 to 2 million Cambodians in 4 years, 1/4 of the population. One of the most concentrated genocides in history, and most people know almost nothing about it. Ask someone on the street about the Holocaust, they'll know. Hitler, 6 million Jews, concentration camps. Ask about Stalin, they'll know. Gulags, millions dead, Soviet terror. Ask about Mao, they might know. Cultural Revolution, Great Leap Forward, tens of millions dead. Ask about Pol Pot? Most people draw a blank. Maybe they've heard of the killing fields, but don't know details. Most can't explain what Year Zero meant, why cities were evacuated, why people were executed for wearing glasses. The Cambodian genocide is the forgotten genocide. Why? Because it was inconvenient. Because acknowledging it complicated Cold War narratives. Because Cambodia is small and geographically remote from Western consciousness. Because Vietnam, America's enemy, was the country that stopped it, making the story uncomfortable for American foreign policy. Because the West continued recognizing the Khmer Rouge diplomatically for years after the genocide ended, making it awkward to acknowledge their crimes. But we can't afford to forget, for 3 crucial reasons. First, justice for victims. The dead deserve to be remembered. The survivors deserve acknowledgement of what was done to them. Forgetting a genocide is a second killing, erasing the victims not just from life, but from history. Cambodia's survivors are aging. The generation that experienced the genocide firsthand is dying. Their children carry intergenerational trauma, but didn't experience the events directly. Soon there will be no living survivors. If we don't preserve their testimony, document their experiences, teach their history, the genocide risks fading from collective memory entirely. Second, warning system. The patterns that enabled Cambodia's genocide haven't disappeared. Anti-intellectualism, contempt for expertise, nostalgia for imaginary pasts, purity spirals, destruction of trust. These dynamics are visible in contemporary politics globally. They're not producing genocide now. But neither did they immediately produce genocide in Cambodia. These patterns developed over years before exploding into mass killing. Understanding Cambodia gives us a pattern recognition system. When we see contempt for education, attacks on intellectuals, celebration of ignorance, idealization of impossible pasts, we should recognize these as warning signs, not guarantees of genocide, but indicators of ideological dynamics that have produced genocide before. Third, resistance strategy. Studying how genocides happen teaches us how to resist them. The Khmer Rouge succeeded partly because resistance was difficult. They moved quickly, controlled information, isolated potential resistors, used violence to crush opposition. But resistance was possible. Some people hid their education, protected others, sabotaged from within, escaped to tell the world. Understanding these histories prepares us to recognize similar situations and respond more effectively. We learn what early intervention looks like. We understand why international action matters. We recognize the cost of geopolitical indifference to human suffering. So what do we do with this knowledge? Action 1. Educate ourselves and others. Most people don't know about Cambodia. Tell them, share this history. When anti-intellectual rhetoric appears, reference Cambodia. When contempt for expertise is normalized, remind people where that logic leads. Make the Cambodian genocide part of our collective knowledge base alongside the Holocaust and other well-known genocides. Action 2. Support survivors and descendants. Cambodia is still recovering. Supporting Cambodian communities, especially trauma-informed mental health services, education initiatives, and genocide documentation projects helps. Organizations like the Documentation Center of Cambodia, the Tuol Sleng Genocide Museum, and survivor advocacy groups need resources to preserve evidence and testimony before survivors die. Action 3. Resist anti-intellectual patterns. When education is attacked as elitism, defend it. When expertise is dismissed as conspiracy, reinforce its value. When ignorance is celebrated as authenticity, push back. When nostalgia for imaginary pasts is weaponized, insist on historical accuracy. These seem like small acts, but they resist the ideological patterns that enabled Cambodia's genocide. Action 4. Demand justice. The Khmer Rouge Tribunal has been slow, limited, and incomplete. Most perpetrators never face justice, but the principle matters. Genocide must have consequences. Support international criminal justice. Oppose realpolitik that sacrifices human rights for geopolitical convenience. Insist that stopping genocide is more important than diplomatic nuance. Action 5. Remember Year Zero as warning. The core insight from Cambodia: utopian ideologies detached from human reality produce catastrophe. When someone promises to reset civilization, to return to purer past, to eliminate corrupt elements and create paradise, be very afraid. These visions require destroying what exists, and that destruction always requires violence against those deemed impure or obstacles to utopia. Pol Pot promised Year Zero. He delivered hell. His attempt to create agrarian paradise murdered a quarter of his nation. His rejection of modernity destroyed the very people he claimed to liberate. The lesson isn't all change is dangerous or utopian thinking always leads to genocide. It's be deeply skeptical of visions that require destroying existing society, that promise purity through elimination, that glorify ignorance, that attack knowledge itself. Cambodia teaches us that anti-intellectual ideology, when taken to its logical extreme, produces mass death. That nostalgia for imaginary pasts can justify actual atrocities. That the demonization of education and expertise can lead to genocide of the educated. These patterns haven't disappeared. They're recurring in different forms, in different contexts. Cambodia is warning. Are we listening? The killing fields are silent now. The skulls in the memorial stupas stare with empty eyes at visitors who come to remember. The photographs at Tuol Sleng, rows of faces, teachers and students and children, all dead, bear witness to what happens when ideology becomes more important than humanity. They died because they were educated, because they lived in cities, because they wore glasses, because they thought, because they knew, because they existed in a world that Pol Pot's Year Zero couldn't accommodate. We owe them memory. We owe them justice. We owe them the promise that their deaths will teach us to recognize the patterns before they produce genocide again. 25% of Cambodia died. The world looked away. Let's not look away from the lesson. Remember Cambodia. Resist anti-intellectualism. Defend knowledge. Question utopian promises. Insist on human complexity over ideological purity. The killing fields teach us what happens when we forget these principles. Let's not forget.